Economic integration is sort of a end stage to globalism in which you integrate global economies from around the world. Global integration, economic integration, is highly connected to concepts such as free trade, international cooperation, globalism, customs unions, stuff like this. While it is opposed to things like protectionism, economic nationalism, things like this. In this video, I'm going to explain what economic integration is and some of the advantages and disadvantages of it. As for an example that we might have of economic integration right now, we have the European Union. They're on their way towards having a fully integrated economy, so they're heading in that direction, but there is still a long ways to go. And in this video, I'm going to explain the different stages of economic integration, what they infer, what they entail, and other interesting information. The first step towards economic integration is preferential trading areas. So what are preferential trading areas? Well, we're going to do an MS Paint, okay? I'm really good at MS Paint. Preferential trading area is basically 3 or more nations deciding that, hey, we're kind of chill with trading with each other, right? Country A, B, and C, they're vibing. They're like, okay, you know what? We can trade with each other. We're going to reduce, for example, tariffs on each other's products, and we're going to try to work together as much as we can. This doesn't mean free trade. This doesn't mean unobstructed trade. It just means preferential trade. So they want to trade more with each other, basically. What this does is it entails the relationship between these 3 parties, but it doesn't make any prescriptions on how the parties involved should handle external parties. A, B, C are kind of chilling. They're vibing, these 3 countries. They're doing their thing. Country D is not part of what's going on here. And because it's still just a preferential trading area, every single one of these nations can have their own trade policy towards country D. So country B, for example, they might love country D. Hell yeah, we love country D. We can, we can trade as much as we want. We have 0 tariffs or anything with each other. And we're just vibing, okay? Now country C, they're a bit more skeptical of country D, okay? They're like, okay, we can trade with you as well. You can be like similar trade relations as I have with country A and B. Not as strong as your relationship with B, but, we can still trade. We're kind of vibing. Now, country A hates country D. They don't want to trade at all. One of their prime ministers called the other prime minister a dipshit on Twitter. So they're not trading, okay? They don't enjoy each other's company. The second example of this are free trade areas. The thing that differentiates free trade areas from preferential trading areas is that instead of the relationship between these countries being like, okay, we want to encourage more trade, but it's nothing like hard yet. These 3 countries have complete free trade with one another, okay? No tariffs, everybody's happy, hippy-dippy trading moment, everybody is enjoying themselves. No restrictions, just as much trade as they'd want. Once again, free trade areas make no restrictions on the 3 parties or the 3 or more parties' relationship with other countries. So once again, B can be completely vibing with D, C can be, kind of, we're cool, and A still thinks D is disgusting, and vice versa. Free trade areas. Then there is the customs union, which is similar to the free trade areas, except for now the nation's ability to sort of do their own thing with country D doesn't exist anymore. These 3 countries are doing their own thing, okay? They need to have a collective policy against country D and how they want to do this trading. So they have what's called a customs union. So they have, like equal customs for all countries that trade with this trading block, okay? With trading block ABC, let's call them trading block ABC. Given that one country does not want to trade with them, one country really wants to trade with them, and one is ambivalent, you might expect the policy of the ABC trading block towards country D to be ambivalent. We're kind of chilling here. This next step has less to do with this necessarily, with how the countries relate themselves to other countries external of the trading block, and more with increased amount of benefits for these 3 countries to work together. Things like this include having a common market with common policies on, for example, regulations. So, for example, environmental regulations, labor rights, stuff like this. Free movement of goods, basically furthermore like no tariffs. So pretty much what had been established already before. Free movement of things like labor as well. Free movement of people. So you basically have some level of collectivized policies between these 3 countries that go beyond just like not having tariffs with each other. You have more common goals when it comes to when it comes to the way you want to regulate your economies. An excellent example of this is the EU. While there is a Eurozone, which is a subsection of nations within the EU as a whole functions like this. It's a common market. They, as a whole, have a large customs union in which they have collectively decided on the way that they will handle trade with other nations. And beyond that, they also have a series of common policies that go for all EU countries, such as common regulations, for example, farming regulations in the EU, and things like the free movement of people. It is very, very easy to migrate, go on vacation, to do whatever with other countries within the EU. The next step is an economic and monetary union, where you level up the relationships and the common policies that country A, B, and C have with each other. Beyond just having, common regulations, free movement of people and stuff like that, now you take a lot more hardline economic policies when it comes to the way you decide to regulate your economy. So things like, for example, having a common currency is a big thing here. Economic and monetary unions is, for example, like the Eurozone. This also means, because you have a common currency, that you also have a common central bank. This means that, for example, different exchange rate fluctuations between the countries disappear. This also makes a currency a lot more stable, because the broader a market behind a currency, the more stable the currency will be. So let's say, for example, to explain this, you have the euro, a currency that is used by a bunch of countries in Europe with pretty strong economies relative to, like many other countries. And they all share this currency together. They have a lot of capital backing up this currency. It's a pretty stable currency. Now, if you look at the currency of some, small country, for example, let's say Sweden to some extent, because they aren't part of the Eurozone, the crown, the Swedish crown, is a lot more unstable than the euro. So let's say that Sweden has massive issues with obtaining natural resources, for example. Let's say that our forest is we have a big forest fire and burn down or whatever. This is going to be devastating for our economy, and therefore will be bad for our currency as well. Should we have been part of the Eurozone, for example, then it wouldn't bother us just, quite as much, because we're still interconnected with the common markets of the other countries within, the Eurozone. The currency isn't going to take as much of a hit, so therefore the Swedish currency of the euro then wouldn't take as much of a hit. And as a result of this, you will also see more sort of business activity because your currency is more stable. It's seen as a safe investment. There's less perceived risk in trading with countries that have a strong collective currency that is used by multiple parties. Things like, for example, transaction costs and stuff like that, such as exchanging currency and trade and stuff like that, also disappears, basically even further streamlining trade that it already is, because even though you have free trade, if there's still different currencies, then there's still often a transaction fee between transferring goods or services for different levels of currency. And on top of that, this makes markets more sort of competitive and equalizes prices across the board. Because all of these countries are using the same currency, it becomes easier to tell, what the price of a product is between the two countries. Because they're worth the same, consumers have access to more information, it's easier for them to make economic decisions, and as a result of having more informed consumers, you increase competition basically, because it's easier for the consumers to pick among the cheapest product, because they have more information available to them, right? These are the advantages of an economic and monetary union, but there are still disadvantages. So disadvantages may include the fact that, there is a central bank setting the interest rates. That can be problematic in the sense that, let's say that you're having a massive issue with the fact that you're importing a lot more than you're exporting. Something another country might be able to do, if they were not part of the economic and monetary union, is they might, on purpose, deflate the value of their currency. So make their currency worth less. What does this do to their, imports and exports? Well, because their currency is worth less, the domestic population will be able to import less products because their money is now worth less internationally. So the imports would fall. But because your currency is worth less, it will take a second for prices to be able to catch up and adjust to the decrease in the value. So what will happen then is that your exports will increase. Because now, since, the price for a hammock was what, let's say 20 of whatever currency you have, since that value of the currency is then deflated, that will be cheaper, even though the units of currency is still the same. And as a result, more people will buy from your country because your currency is worth less, so it becomes cheaper to you. On top of that, other more like specific things, like for example, having a common budget in some regards for certain sectors of the economy, or for example, having harmonized tax rates might make it a bit difficult if nations are struggling with specific domestic issues that isn't, shared by the rest of the nations within the Eurozone or the Economic and Monetary Union. You lose on a lot of like control, I guess, of your own economic, your own interest rates and the value of your own currency, which can be used as a tool to solve various domestic economic situations that you may find yourself in. On top of that, there's also a fairly large sort of like upfront cost to transferring your currency, right? Let's say that Sweden, for example, today would be like, okay, we want to use the euro. We have all this money right now in circulation that, number one, needs to be transferred to a euro. Number two, will be completely useless now, will be worth nothing because it's no longer the official currency of Sweden. And number three, you need to print a bunch of like new money, physical manifestations of the money. You need to like replace, I guess, all the money that people have already like saved up in their bank accounts and stuff like that to the new currency. So that's pretty expensive and it's time consuming. Overall, benefits for an economic and monetary union: you have more confidence in your currency is a lot more stable, you attract more business ventures, the economies become more competitive. Disadvantages: you lose some control with certain means by which you might solve domestic economic issues, such as, for example, you having a poor balance of imports and exports, for example, or having issues with your domestic tax rate or stuff like that. On top of that, there is the upfront cost. The final step, a lot easier to explain, is the complete economic integration. At this point, nations individually would have no control over economic policy or fiscal policy and stuff like that. Fundamentally, all these countries, while they may have their own, for example, social laws, everything related to the economy and trade and fiscal policy would work on this Eurozone basis. So basically what happens is that the governments, individual nations' government, lose their ability to make independent economic decisions, and they basically have control of mostly, like, I guess, social reforms. And this is the direction that the Eurozone is headed in right now. They're headed towards full economic integration. Whatever advantages and disadvantages you might face with an economic or monetary union are increased. So your benefits are increased, but the disadvantages are also increased. So the things you might want to assure yourself before you move towards full economic integration is that all the countries within the economic and monetary union are on a somewhat even playing field when it comes to the stability and the strength of their economy, and that all their fiscal and economic policy are already pretty similar to one another. Once this has been established, then a transition to full integration would work a lot easier. At this point, assuming that you've gotten all countries in an economic and monetary union to a similar level economically, a lot of the negatives disappear. Like, a lot of them. The ability to, for example, regulate imports, exports, and stuff like that is reduced to a massive extent. Issues with domestic tax policy is reduced to a massive extent, because at this point, all the economic issues or economic situations of the countries are all extremely similar, so that if there is an issue facing one country, chances are it will be facing other countries as well, and therefore the overall organization, the Eurozone, will be inclined and incentivized to push a policy that fixes this issue. That's the sort of step-by-step process to economic integration. So at the end of the day, there's a lot of progress that needs to be done towards, achieving economic integration, for example. I personally think that as a long-term goal, economic integration is desirable because of all the benefits it has. Additionally, because it allows for an ease of the implementation of multilateral trade agreements, or having large policies for example, an economic and monetary union like a Eurozone. So let's say, for example, all the countries in the EU join the Eurozone. They're moving towards that right now. They want to get to that point. There's been a pretty big setback in the in Britain leaving, but since they've left the European Union, I guess they're sort of out of it at this point, right? But let's say that all the countries that are currently in the European Union also join the Eurozone. At this point, the European Union should be working extremely hard at equalizing the economies of all these different nations. Once these are equalized, they can move towards full integration. Now, what will you be looking at then? you would be looking at something that is practically a country when it comes to economic and trade relations, which has massive amounts of influence, but is made up by representatives from all the different member states. What is this massive power of trade and economic strength able to do to the world in general? Well, remember these things that I talked about here, how they have a common policy towards external countries. This is super important and super interesting. Let's say, for example, that the Eurozone, this big economic monetary union that has seen full integration, you don't even need to see full integration. Really, you just need to be a customs union to be able to do this. But having full integration obviously helps. They decide that, hey, all the trade relationships we have with country D, let's say country D is representative of countries in Southeast Asia that right now produce a lot of consumer goods. They decide that, hey, we're not going to trade with country or countries D unless they meet these levels of labor requirements or labor rights. What happens then? Well, country D will lose a massive amount of their exports if they do not abide by the sort of expectations that this trade bloc had placed on them. This is, in my opinion, the way by which we solve issues like poor, like labor standards and labor laws in developing countries, and the way by which we solve issues like climate change. Because through these trade agreements with large powers who are in agreement that, hey, labor rights are good, climate change is bad, for example, they can, through their geopolitical and national influence in trade, decide that, hey, you got to fix your shit. That's massive because these are some of the biggest issues that we face right now when it comes to the world in general. And climate change and labor rights are just a few of the mentions. You can do this for social policy as well, or nations that don't guarantee minority rights, for example. The exploitation of natural resources, such as, for example, clean water, can also be regulated in this way. There's a lot of good that could come out of, big trading blocks like these. On the flip side, there's also a lot of harm. Depending on the politics of these trading blocks, you could also see very, very negative things, occurring. So it's a positive and a negative. But at this point, we need to do this. We need to take the stride. We need to take the gamble. Because otherwise, there's no way we're going to be able to solve issues like climate change in time. Beyond this, another thing that's really good with having full economic integration is that this may sound counterintuitive, but because nations individually, nation B and nation C, will be less likely to be able to sustain themselves without trade. For example, let's say country C was producing cars, or 1,000 euros per car. This is before the integration took place, and country A was able to do it for 800 per car. Once the economic integration takes place, country C will cease to produce these cars because they produce it less efficiently, and they just import it from country A. Now, country A can have dependence on country B and country C in other, departments, but that's an example with the cars, for example. When you open up international trade, country C doesn't have to rely on itself to produce everything. They can get it at higher quality for cheaper from other countries. Because countries are more dependent on each other and their economies would be a lot weaker and a lot more expensive without this cooperation, wars are heavily disincentivized. Because think about it. Before all of this, when there was only country A, B, C, and D, okay? There is no strong economic incentive, not as strong at least, for country B not to just invade country C, for example. But when the countries are integrated, if country B were to invade country C, country B would lose out on a lot. Because they're the aggressors, all the other countries, country A, wouldn't work on, nice terms with country B. So they would not be receiving any of the trade, and they would be supporting country C would be supporting country A, and country C would stop support for country B. Of course, this is something that has to be done in a sustainable way, like I mentioned previously. If there isn't sort of a level of economic harmony between the countries before integration takes place, then you might leave some countries behind. So for me, it's a question of pragmatism, of being able to do it well, of competence, more than it is of sort of ideological prevalence. Because if this is done well, I see very few arguments against it.